صل على محمد.
رحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا رسول الله. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. طبتم وطابت الأرض التي فيها دفنتم سيدي. فيا ليتنا يا ليتنا كنا معكم سادتي فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. صلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والصلاة والسلام على أفضل الأنبياء والمرسلين بعد الخلائق أجمعين سيدنا وسندنا وشفيعنا مولانا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين اصطفاهم الله أجمعين. أما بعد، فقال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق وهو أصدق الصادقين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ومن يبتغي غير الإسلام دينا فلن يقبل منه. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد. My respected elders, my respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For the past 2 nights, we've created 2 different cases, and hopefully tonight we can capitalize on that discussion. The first night, thank you, we created a case in trying to understand a workable definition of kufr and what it actually means and what it actually entails. And we said that surely kufr cannot simply mean anyone who disagrees with me or anyone who doesn't believe in what I believe, because that is a very literalist definition of what kufr means. We gave Quranic examples to debunk that definition and gave another understanding which makes a lot more sense than the first definition. Now last night we started discussing aspects of practicality and rationality within the Islamic worldview, and how the terrorism that we see today that exists has roots that have existed from way before. And we saw the progress of rationality and the lack of rationality in certain schools of thought. Now finally tonight, I'd like to actually make more points on the final point that I made yesterday, which is what is to be done. Now ideally, the discussion surrounding Islamic extremism today and the extremism that we see in the world is in itself a discussion that's extremely important. There have been military talks, there have been talks on other topics, but at the end of the day, as we mentioned yesterday, as much as we try to have military strikes on certain groups, there is an ideological discussion that needs to be had. And tonight, I want to bring about one concept or theory that I think can act as a very strong ideology that can fight the extremism that we see today. Because wherever we look around us, we seem to be seeing a form of extremism. This form of extremism, mind you, does not only come in a liberal circle, it can also come in conservative circles. It exists in the world today. And today I'd like to discuss something that I think can be a workable potential theory that can go against the extremism that we see today. Now, talks about religious diversity and religious pluralism within the Muslim circles have not gone far typically. And there's a reason for that. The ideology and the way that we typically have thought about religious diversity and pluralism has been very limited. And tonight, I'd like to kind of create a case for what religious pluralism is and how its understanding has evolved and how it could potentially be the cure to the distress and the religious problems that we see in the world today. Now mind you, as we said yesterday, and we laid it very clearly, that by no means are these issues simply theological. They are very political issues. They are issues that need to be discussed on a political front as well as a theological front. But for the gathering here and for the majlis, I'd like to focus on the theological aspect of certain issues, as we mentioned yesterday. And I'd like to look at this in a number of points. Now, please be very keen for this, because I think this can actually be a practical, workable model to try to create some sort of reformation and change. Now, mind you, we said yesterday that there were schools of thought that had abandoned any glimpses of rationality. And I think this can not only be a theoretical discussion, but also a very practical discussion, focusing on real issues. The first point I'd like to discuss is, what is really the main difference between religious diversity and pluralism, if any? And how have we typically been understanding that religious pluralism, and how is it different than how we've understood it? Second of all, is there a difference between focusing on values and beliefs when it comes to other human beings, and what effect does it have on the way that we see pluralism? Third of all, what does the Quran and the Hadith say about a sense of pluralistic form of religion? Does Islam encompass other religions and other worldviews? Is there a red line which Islam says you cannot cross this and still be a Muslim? And how do we create those lines and borders so that we can interact with others, but at the same time keep our own identity to who we are as a people? Because if there's something that's important to discuss today is, what is this Muslim identity? Everybody seems to be springing up with their own identity. What is a Muslim identity that we could possibly create? Fourth of all, when discussing and looking at the Messenger of Allah, Muhammad, the charter of Medina seems to be an amazing symbol of tolerance and pluralism in the time of Rasulullah. What does the charter have to say about Rasulullah and his relationships with Muslims when he established Medina, which was an Islamic state by definition? And how does that Islamic state differ from the Islamic state that we see today? And what does the Constitution of Medina create as an alliance between the Muslims and the Jews? Finally, I'd like to look at the movement of Imam Mahdi and how that apocalyptic movement is so drastically different than the so-called apocalyptic movement that we see today. I think if I look at these, we can hopefully create a specific case for a workable, tenable theory for a movement that can act as a counter-ideology to the ideologies that exist today. Because in reality, we need to fight ideologies with counter-ideologies. We cannot simply go on saying this doesn't represent us, this doesn't represent us, which it doesn't. But we need to create ideologies that show our proactivity. Not because Muhammad. And I need to know, not because Muslims are responsible. In no way should one Muslim sitting in Maryland or in America be responsible for the action of another so-called Muslim who's in Iraq or any other part of the world. Islam is not one monolithic identity. Islam, like any religion, is very diverse in the way that people interpret their text, and therefore I can't hold one person or group accountable to respond to that other group that seems to have created such malicious theology. Now, the first question in discussion is this: what is the difference between religious diversity and religious pluralism? And the first point to note is this: religious diversity is typically knowing that within my community, I've got people who are really different than me. I live in a neighborhood where there's a Jew that lives next to me, a Christian that's next to me as well, a atheist that's across the street from me. I know and I realize that in my community, there is a difference in the people that are around me. We are a conglomerate as a society of so many different people, and perhaps that's a beautiful thing. The melting pot that exists in America and Canada and the UK, because these are such metropolitan cities, you might not see it in other places around the world. There are certain neighborhoods, for example, in Iraq where I grew up, where everyone was a Shia Muslim. In every household that you knocked on, there's a Shia Muslim next to you. Now these are first world problems where we now have so many different people, we need to address these differences. So religious diversity is only acknowledging that the people who are next to me are different than me. That's knowing there's religious diversity. Religious pluralism goes a step further than that and says something else. Religious pluralism says, I acknowledge that there is diversity around me. And I know that people are different, but the attitude towards difference is extremely different in its own way. Religious pluralism says that after realizing people are different, I now engage with that difference to create bridges and avenues of discussion where people can come together and try to understand this difference. Not so that they can give up their beliefs and their thoughts. No. The most important part, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Muhammad. Historically, the way pluralism has been taught to us has been a very, very basic concept. It's been given to us in its 1970s form ever since John Hick first talked about it. And that model was a failed model. A failed model because it does not capture the reality of existential truth in the world. Now let me kind of speak about that. صلى على محمد وآل محمد صلى على محمد وآل محمد. In the 1970s, John Hick, who's a famous philosopher, hypothesized that people of religion are all really, really similar. And he gave us very, very infamous elephant model. He said people of religion are like human beings who walk into a dark room with an elephant inside of it. Every person feels a part of the elephant. One person feels the trunk, the other person feels the legs, one person will feel the back, another person will feel the hair. Everybody in this dark room feels the elephant, but nobody can actually see it. And he says religious truths are that way. Everybody grabs a part of the truth. They're looking and talking about the same thing, but they each describe it differently from their own world views. Right? So in reality, to that idea, there is no difference between the truth that a Christian holds and the truth that a Muslim holds. In essence, they're both about the same thing. Now, I think parts of that is true and parts of that is deeply wrong. I cannot actually equate the two concepts of God just from an academic standpoint. The fact that God is one or infinite versus God having three parts are mutually very, very different. A religious worldview that says a cow is to be worshipped, I'm not degrading that worldview, is very different than a religious worldview that says I eat meat. By definition, those are very, very different. What's dangerous is when we say every single worldview or religion is all the same. It gets us to the same place. And that's just not the case. I can never equate the worldview of the ISIS mentality to any religion that's out there because those are a set of really bad ideas. So what we've typically been given is when people say pluralism from the minbar, there has been this offset immediately to say, this is really scary stuff. Are you saying that I can believe any religion that I want because all religions are technically the same? That definition has been changed a long time ago. If you just Google Harvard's Pluralism Project, it's perhaps one of the most profound programs that's out there today. And what Harvard does is they've written a very, very comprehensive definition of what pluralism is. It is a system whereby people with different beliefs interact, bringing in their differences to the table of interaction. I don't leave them at the door. I don't walk into the room of discussion and I leave my differences at the door and say, all right, let's come in here and just talk about the things that we like, which is typically what's done. We'll come into the room, we'll talk about God and love and existence, and that's all great. But we typically leave our differences at the door and we walk in without our differences. Religious pluralism in its modern form says no. Let people talk about their differences, but nurture their differences in a way where they do not only focus on beliefs, but they also focus on values. And that's really important because there's a big difference. When I look at someone who's different than me, because the discussion on beliefs and values has a very, very big emphasis on the way that we see religion in general. When I look at someone who's of a different religion than me, say I look at someone who's a Hindu, and I see them and I see that they worship a cow and they think that a cow is holy. Most people, their immediate reaction is to be very, very turned off and say to themselves, I can't believe that people believe and value these types of things. when in reality they make no separation between beliefs and values. My point is extremely important, and I'm going to get to this in just a moment. Just because someone has a different belief than you does not mean that the value is very different. So, for example, a modern Muslim or a modern believer may believe that a grandma, my grandmother or anybody's grandmother, should not be eaten alive. That is just a very basic human understanding. Cannibalism to anyone shouldn't be done in any way. Now a Hindu understands that very, very differently. The way a Hindu understands that is, he says, you know what, in my theology I believe that my grandmother gets reincarnated in a cow. The reason I don't eat the cow is because, like you, I believe that I can't eat my grandmother. And so there is some sort of belief or a value, not a belief, a value that we share. We both agree that we should not eat our grandmothers. We approach the belief in a very, very different way. So for example, this is really important. Most Muslims, when they speak about Christianity, they come to the conclusion that Christians believe that God is three separate things. And when you take the time to sit with a Christian, you find that many Christian theologians, if not all of them, actually believe that God is infinite. And their explanation is quite phenomenal. They want the same value, which is God is all-powerful, all-able, but the belief and the way they approach it is very, very different. They give God three different essences. And the way they've understood it is, the same way a human being can have a soul and a body and is yet the same person, a Christian can then come and say from their own theology, well, God can be that same way. Now, that belief might not be true, but the point that I'm expressing is that their values are very, very similar. Now, when we start talking about morality, we'll soon come to see that people's values are very similar to us. Yes, they approach things very differently. Some of their morality might be different than ours, but the general values are very similar. Believe it or not, even something as repulsive within the Arabian society as burying daughters has been something that we've seen throughout history. Whenever we talk about the burial of daughters by the Arabians, we talk about it as if it's an isolated case, as if this never used to happen. This, mind you, happened in many places, especially the Eskimo. The Eskimo have had such practices for a while, and it's very, very motivated by an economic situation. Now, the belief seems very different. You're burying your daughter? You must be very different than me. And if you look at the reasons, they're actually not that different than the reasons that we typically protect our children. Now, the belief is wrong, 100%, but I'm trying to give you a striking example where even somebody's belief is so different, but the values might be not as different as we think they are. We all believe that our daughter should be protected, and our children should be protected, and we'll take the most extreme measures to protect our children. If that means that we have to sacrifice ourselves, then we would do so. Now, the early Arabian had a very interesting way of thinking about this. When you're living in an area where every moment someone can raid your village, and your daughter can be taken as captive and be sold as a slave to someone else and live the most degrading life, you live your whole life thinking to myself, at any moment this young, beautiful child can be taken as a slave. In other situations, they realize that this young girl cannot care for herself. I have to feed her. If I have 2 or 3 other children and I cannot feed all of them, I must sacrifice this young girl because the boys can actually work and she can't. So the way we think about it is when these people used to go and bury their daughters, they would bury them with smiles on their faces. I'm so happy I'm burying my daughter. It was not the case. These people would bury their daughters in a very, very wrong way, but the values and the way that they thought they were doing it were the same. They thought that they were actually doing the right thing and that they would protect their daughters. And this is the case for so many people. Look at groups like ISIS. Even though the beliefs are so different, and their values on the onslaught seem to be very different. If you ask an ISIS member, what do you think? Should an innocent person be killed? They say, no. But you're killing so many innocent people. No, innocent person should not be killed. You see videos of them playing with their young children, crying over their young children. I saw one man looking at his young child and just crying. And I thought, how many innocent people must you have killed and you're still yet crying about your child? There's this human fitrah which seems to be promoting a certain sense of values. As much as our beliefs differ, our values at some point remain very, very similar, even though we profess them in such different, skewed, messed up ways. Now, the approach to religious pluralism is an approach that doesn't only focus on beliefs, but focuses on values. And here is where we see a difference between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Please be very keen to these because they're completely different. Orthodoxy is the approach of religion where your sole attention is to the beliefs that the other human being has. This is like the investigative Muslim that comes to every person and says, what do you believe? How much do you believe? Do you believe 100%? 50%? Do you believe in Allah, Imam Ali, Nubuwwah, Imama, Mi'ad? This is the very, very orthodox believer whose focus is solely on beliefs. How do you believe in something? Orthopraxy takes a very different approach. Orthopraxy says it's not about the beliefs that you have, but it's about the actions that you are professing. Are you acting Islamically? It's not now, are you believing in what Islam believes? It's are you acting as Islam said you must act? Now, I don't want to make it seem like these two things are extremely exclusive, because they aren't. There should be a mixture of the two. The problem is when we typically take one and we put it on top of the other, where orthodoxy becomes the ultimate end of everything. These are the same individuals who say, if you don't believe in Imam Ali, you go to hell. If you don't believe in this, you go to hell. If you don't believe in Islam in this way, you go to hell. My Islam and the specifics that I believe in are so true that anyone who disagrees with me on even a small issue, they're going to burn. I don't care who you are. It's such a belief-centric view of what religion is meant to be that they totally forget the orthopraxy of the situation, that the actions that a person has are extremely important. When you do miss that, when you do only focus on orthodoxy and forget orthopraxy, which is people's actions, you miss some of the most beautiful moments in life. And I'll give you an example. If you've ever heard of a famous ethicist from Princeton by the name of Peter Singer, he's got perhaps one of the most religious ethics that I have ever seen from an individual, even though he's an atheist. This man's worldview is, if you read him, you think, this is Imam Ali. What he's talking about is exactly what Imam Ali would do. His basic ethical principle for helping other human beings around in the world, he says, with all this famine that's happening in the world, we have a responsibility, and he actually tries to live this way. We have a responsibility to live to the lowest means possible and work all of our lives simply to help those that are in need. And if there is a minute in my life or a second in my life where I am doing something for my own pleasure and not helping those who are in need, then I have failed morally as a human being. Now, this is a man who doesn't believe in God. A man who's created thousands of systems around the world to try to help those that are impoverished. And you think, this guy is not a Muslim. He's got no Islam in him. But the orthopraxy is there. If you are only focused on the belief system and you forget the values of a human being, you miss that beauty in life. You miss that other human being in front of you that is a Christian or a Hindu or a Jew or even an atheist that's doing some of the most phenomenal things, because you're so focused on your belief systems, you can't see the values that you share. Pluralism is trying to look at other people and saying, we are different. We know that we are different. But how can we actually focus on the values that we all share to understand and to create a change in the world that's around us? If you ever read the works of Pope John Paul, when he writes in the Vatican, as a Muslim reading the works of a Christian, I can very strongly relate to the economic changes that he tried to make. Pope John Paul writes that the gap between the rich and the poor are so bad that we need to get rid of the capitalism that we see in the world. Now that is a very, very moving concept. That even I, as a Muslim living in 21st century America, living in America and seeing the gap between the rich and the poor, those who make the 1 billion and those who barely make 20K, I can appreciate that worldview because it shares my values. This is coming from a Christian Pope. This isn't coming from a Muslim. But I can see the values that my religion would share. Now the question that comes is, what does Islam have to say about this? And what does the Quran have to say about this? There's one verse that's typically been given as opposition to this concept. And that verse is the one that I started off with. Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَمَنْ يَبْتَغِي غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا فَلَنْ يُقْبَلَ مِنْهُ. Those who take anything than Islam as a religion, Allah will not accept from them. Now there have been two main interpretations for this. A very literalist interpretation and a much more metaphorical interpretation. I'll share those with you tonight. The verse interpretation says this, that if someone is not, and the verse translates, whoever takes anything other than Islam as a religion, Allah will not accept from them. The verse interpretation says, Allah means literally, that if you are a person, and Shaykh Mutahhari comments on this, he says Allah will take from you if you're a Christian, a believer in Allah and the hereafter. However, if you do not believe in a God, and you don't believe in a hereafter, there is no way for you to see any form of salvation in this world and the hereafter. This is the opinion of Shaykh Mutahhari. I can give you the source after if you'd like to see it. Now that is one interpretation. I don't think it's a very literal interpretation because Shaykh Mutahhari does take into account the fact that there are Christians, Jews, and Hindus who can see some sort of growth in this model. The other interpretation has been, and many scholars and other scholars have interpreted this way, and they've said that when Allah says Islam in this verse, He's not talking about the noun Islam, which is this banner of religion that exists that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam brought down. Allahumma ala Muhammad wa li Muhammad. That Muhammad brought down 1400 years ago. But this form of Islam, when Allah uses in the Quran, is talking about the verb, which is the submission to the truth and to the values of religion. So some have reached a conclusion that even if you do not believe in Islam, if your values are there as a human being, you are an upright, working human being, you can see some sort of growth in your life because you have submitted to the values of religion. Mind you, the banner might not be there. The banner of Shia or the banner of Muslim or the banner of Mu'min might not be there, but the values are there. Now I typically ask a question when I discuss this, and this is something for us to reflect about. Hussein ibn Ali, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, is seen as the lifeline in our madhab. Without him, the Shia madhab might not have been there, or truth in itself in Islam might not have ever emerged, because that's the pinnacle of evil versus good. And I think to myself, I look at Hussein ibn Ali and I ask a very hypothetical question. Imagine Hussein ibn Ali, the same Hussein ibn Ali, if he did not have the banner of Islam over his head, would I see him the same way? It's the same Hussein. He did the same amount of greatness. Would I see him the same way, or would I see him differently? The reason I'm posing this question is because I want us to think about this. Are we only following banners? Now, I'm not saying banners are not important. Banners and beliefs are essential to growth and morality. But the question is, are we only following beliefs or banners? Or are we looking at a more depth of values that other human beings have? Now, there's one verse in the Quran which really clarifies the discussion. Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. Now it's a very standard verse that we've heard numerous times, but I want to bring your attention towards the first couple of words. Allah says, يا أيها الناس, O mankind. He doesn't only address, oh you Shia, or oh you Muslims, or oh you whites, or oh you blacks, or oh you rich, or oh you poor. Allah is saying to every human being, whether believer or non-believer, إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ مِنْ ذَكَرٍ وَأُنْثَى أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. The best amongst you, أَتْقَاكُمْ. That who has the most God consciousness, the most taqwa. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Now some can argue and say, well, taqwa in this case means belief. Is there anything that makes it a little bit more clear? Is there something that makes it more clear cut, that even if a person professes a different faith, there might be a possibility for them to see truth or guidance? Rasulullah has a profound hadith, and he says one of the most beautiful statements. He says, a Christian king who is kind to his people is better than a Muslim king who is unkind to his people. Now, what that's highlighting to me is that your professed faith is one thing. As the Quran says, قالت الأعراب آمنا قل لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا. The Arabians come to Rasulullah saying, we believe. Rasulullah says, I don't want your belief. Tell me that you have submit by action. Rasulullah is making a case, the Quran is saying that your orthodoxy and your I believe this and I believe that is not enough to create a stable community. If it's not mixed with orthopraxy, and if it's not mixed with work and hard effort towards values, then what does your belief do for you? And I ask us all today, as a Muslim community, there are many issues that need to be dealt with. Immigration is one issue. Islamophobia in this country is one issue. The rights abuses that we see is one issue. The gap between the rich and the poor is one issue. What good is our faith if we are not working on these values as a Muslim community? There are people who profess faith. I am a Muslim, I am a mu'min. They come to the masjid, they cry for Aba Abdullah. But the minute that's over, in their working values, you don't see an ounce of Muslim values there. In the way that they ask for distribution of wealth and estates, they don't try to create equal pay for those around them. And the way that they deal with men and women, they don't deal in an equal, fair way. These are not values of Islam. If your Islam is only belief-based and you've thrown the orthopraxy out, then you are like those people who went to Rasulullah and said, قَالَتِ الْأَعْرَابُ آمَنَّا. We believe. Rasulullah says, keep your iman. Give me your actions. Give me your submission. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Muhammad. I want to emphasize that the beliefs are extremely important, and in no way am I saying beliefs are unimportant, because I think they are the mainframe of growth. But to belittle other person's work and to look at someone else as, this is just a kafir. What could I possibly get from this kafir? What could I possibly get from this Christian man? What can I possibly get from this non-Muslim that I don't already have? But to approach the world in an open-minded way. There are non-Muslims around us in the world who are doing phenomenal work, and even Muslims as well. Now, if we can approach that community, and I see typically, and I promote this to our young people, when some young person comes to me and asks me, Brother Ali, what should I do for my future? I say to them, do something and engage with a community that you would have thought you would never engage with. Go become part of a Rotary Club. Go join a hospital of non-Muslims. Go work with someone who is of a different faith. Go talk to people who disagree with you. Go join something that you have never joined before. Become part of this diversity and understand as many people as possible, because you meet some phenomenal people out there. People who really create change. And that's something that's very important. So when Rasulullah says it's not only about iman, but also about submission and action, he's talking about a form of mixture between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Now, the way that this also affects other parts of our theology is very important. Because when we typically discuss Imam al-Mahdi's, Ajjallahu ta'ala farajah al-Sharif, when we discuss Imam Mahdi, and I've heard this before numerous times, we have a very exclusivist Armageddon in the way that we talk about the Imam. And the narrative is very familiar. This man is going to come and he's going to help the Shias, and he's going to care only for the Shias, and there will be war, and he will care for humanity, but he will fight the West and kill the West, etc. You hear all these discussions as if the only ones in the world that have an issue is that part of the world. The world is riddled with many problems. And you typically hear a very exclusivist narrative. Instead of people saying that the Mahdi is going to come for all of mankind. And mind you, some of our hadith even tell us that when the Mahdi arises, the very Muslims who are the ones who are with him will leave him. The ones who profess to love him will leave him. And the Jews and the Christians and the worshippers of the sun and the moon will join him. Now there's a truth in that. The truth that exists is that just because you say you profess and you love the Mahdi does not mean that that love actually exists. If the belief is there, it does not mean that the values are there. Now, the typical apocalyptic discussion that we have is the Mahdi will just simply come and create an Islamic state, and everyone else can join this Islamic state or go against it. Is it as simple and easy as that? Is a discussion of the Mahdi as exclusive as that? What I've heard that's even worse is when the Mahdi comes, there will be blood to the knees. Killing will be widespread. And I ask myself, we already have so much violence in the world. Can we actually take any more violence? Now perhaps when we understand the Mahdi or discuss the Mahdi, approaching him as a uniter that unites human beings based on values and not only beliefs. When Rasulullah came to the Arabians, he did exactly this. If you read the Constitution of Medina, which I urge every person to read, if you want to know, because in the media today we hear Islamic values. The values of the Syrian Muslims are very different than the values of the Americans. The values of those in the Middle East are very different than the values of those who are here. Read the Constitution of Medina and tell me that those values are not values that you also agree with. Phenomenal work by Rasulullah. A constitution that's written and he understands the Muslim Ummah in perhaps one of the most phenomenal ways that I've heard. Typically when we think about the Ummah, we think about an Ummah of Muslims, the Muslim Ummah. Rasulullah in the Constitution of Medina redefines Ummah. And he says that within Medina, the Muslims, the Jews of Bani Qaynuqa, the Jews of Bani Haritha, and all of the other tribes of the Jews are to consist one ummah with the Muslims. What he's saying is that the redefinition of ummah is extremely important. No longer is the world that we live in a world where I am only a Muslim. My Jewish neighbor is next to me. My Christian neighbor is next to me. My atheist neighbor lives across the street. A very exclusivist model to the ummah does not work because it leaves out those who are different, those whose values might be very similar to ours. Rasulullah in the Constitution of Medina redefines ummah in one of the most profound ways. No longer is ummah the traditional Muslim community, but ummah, according to Rasulullah, is a community of Jews and Muslims as well. It's perhaps one of the most comprehensive, diverse, early texts that I personally have read and seen. Now that is an example. That is an example where we can look at that and say, how can we grow based on that example? How can we make our mosques more accessible to those who are different than us? Those who are Jews and Christians, even those atheists who might want to visit and see what Islam is about. Because human beings who are different than us don't necessarily hate us. There are many who want to understand more about where we come from. And I tell you, there's so much anti-Muslim rhetoric that's happening in the media. But I think for every bigot that exists out there, there are 10,000 amazing people, and specifically Americans, who would take Muslims in their arms any day of the week. I remember just on my way here, there was a lady sitting next to me, a very old lady, she was about 70 or 80, and we were sitting next to each other, and she was a Christian, and I could tell she was very orthodox in the way she saw Christianity. And she asked me what religion I was, and I just told her I was Muslim. And you'd think that a person who's older, who's very orthodox in the way they think, would be anti-Muslim. And she was a very Republican, Christian American. And she looks at me with the sweetest smile, saying, Muslims are no different than us. They're great people. The media is smearing them. We're generalizing them, etc. And here I was thinking that she might be against Muslims. But we typically get so overdrowned with these negative voices that we forget all the positivity that exists, especially in this country. This very ability for us to have a masjid and be able to talk to others is phenomenal. It's the epitome of religious freedom and expression. Now, issues exist. I don't want to put away from that. But I think if we focus on the positive, there's a lot more. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and his companions was perhaps the epitome of diversity within an area. You saw that with him were Muslims, and even with him there were non-Muslims, the likes of John and Wahab. Wahab's example perhaps stands out as one of the most profound examples. A man who had just been married, hasn't passed 7 months, and he sees Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and he decides to join his campaign. And there's one story that breaks the heart of anyone who hears it. That when Wahab was walking out towards the battlefield, his wife approaches him and she says to him, "We've just been married and you're now going out to the battlefield. Stay with me. Let's go away from this land where we can rejoin our lives." And he looks at her and he says to her, "The truth that I have seen in the eyes of Hussein, I have not seen anywhere else." And these are words coming out of the mouth of a Christian man who has more values than the so-called Muslims opposing Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And he goes out to the battlefield and he's fighting the enemies. And at one point his wife is running after him. And he calls out and looks behind him. And he says to her, "A moment ago you were telling me to come back, and now you are following me into the battlefield. What has happened to you?" She says to him, "Oh Wahab, the cries of Hussein have broken my heart. I heard him sing, Ala hal min nasirin yansurna. Ala hal min mu'inin yu'inuna. Ala hal min يذب عنا." The one who heard these calls was Al-Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam. At one point during the battle, he calls out his aunt Zainab, saying to her, "Amma Zainab, atini bis-sayf wal-asa." And he says to her, "Bring to me a sword and bring me a cane." She says to him, "Ya ibn akhi, what do you want to do with them?" He says to her, "For the cane, I want to stand on it. I'm too weak to walk on my own. And as for the sword, I want to defend my father, Aba Abdullah." Later, when Imam Zainul Abidin sees Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari, and those who are going to Arba'in will get to do that same pilgrimage next to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. When you're there, remember Imam Zainul Abidin returning to Karbala. And what he says to Jabir, Jabir says to the Imam, "Is that Zainul Abidin I hear?" He says to him, "Oh Jabir, it's me." He says to him, "Tell me what happened here." Imam then recites his breaking lines. He says to him, "Ya Jabir, ha huna qutila rijaluna." Oh Jabir, it was here that our men were killed. Oh Jabir, it was here that my father was murdered. Oh Jabir, it was here that al-Asghar's neck was severed. He then sees Lady Zainab alayhi salam stumbling and looking among the graves. He knew which grave Lady Zainab was looking for. She's looking for the grave of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas. Those of you who've been blessed to do the ziyarah of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, you'll notice that the hands of al-Abbas alayhi salam are severed and are quite a difference from where his body was later buried. That's because al-Abbas alayhi salam, after his hands were severed, went for a distance before he fell to the ground. Imam Zainul Abidin takes Lady Zainab alayhi salam to the grave of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas. She sits next to that grave and she says to him, Abbas, how I want to complain to you about Shimr striking my back. Did Amir al-Mu'mineen, our father, not keep you as my protector? Why don't you come now and protect your sister, Abbas? Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا آل محمد أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. Ya Allah. Let's raise our hands towards dua. There are many who have asked us, many who have hajat. We pray for those who need assistance and safety in the world today. We'll recite Amman Yujibu 5 times together and Ya Allah together 11 times. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Amman yujibu al-mudtar idha da'a wa yakshifu as-su'. أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعا ويكشف السوء. أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعا ويكشف السوء. أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعا ويكشف السوء. يا الله 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 يا الله. اللهم نسألك بفاطمة وأبيها وبعلها وبنيها والسر المستودع فيها يا الله. اللهم اقض جميع حوائجنا يا الله. Heal all of our sick ones ya Allah. Make us leaders in our communities ya Allah. ولأرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات نقرأ جميعا سورة المباركة الفاتحة تسبقها صلوات.